Wind howling. Snow drifts silently over a lifeless Ukrainian street. Burned-out tanks lie half-buried in the white dust of winter. The echoes of artillery fade into an eerie silence. A lone flag flutters, torn, colorless, barely hanging onto the broken mast. And in that silence, you can almost hear the ghosts of the past whisper, "How did it come to this?" The world calls it the Russia-Ukraine War. But this is not just a story of two nations, it is the story of an empire that refused to die, and a nation that refused to surrender. Soft piano fades in. To understand this war, you have to go back. Long before 2022, long before the first missiles fell on Kyiv. You have to go back to the fall of an empire that once ruled 1/6 of the world, the Soviet Union. The shadow of an empire, echoing crowd chants, USSR, USSR. For most of the 20th century, the Soviet Union was a symbol of power, vast, cold, unyielding. From the snowy streets of Moscow to the wheat fields of Ukraine, it ruled through ideology and iron will. Ukraine was not just another republic within the Soviet Union. It was the heartland, the breadbasket, the industrial core, the strategic doorway to Europe. Without Ukraine, the Soviet Union was incomplete. And when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, it wasn't just a political collapse. It was an identity crisis. The red flags came down, the statues of Lenin crumbled, and 15 new countries emerged, free but uncertain. Among them stood Ukraine, proud, scarred, and hopeful. Soft wind blowing. But for Russia, something inside never accepted it. In the Kremlin's eyes, Ukraine wasn't a foreign land. It was the same blood, the same history, the same people. To lose Ukraine felt like losing a part of Russia's soul. The promise of freedom. The 1990s were a time of chaos and hope. Ukraine embraced democracy, markets, and the dream of joining the West. But dreams come with a price. While Kyiv tried to stand on its own, Moscow struggled with humiliation. NATO, the Western military alliance, began moving eastward, closer and closer to Russia's borders. Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, one by one they joined NATO. And in Moscow, a dangerous idea began to grow, that the West had deceived Russia. Vladimir Putin rose in that storm. A former KGB officer, silent, calculating, hardened by years in the shadows. He saw Russia's collapse not as liberation but as betrayal. He once called it the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century. For him, rebuilding Russia as greatness meant something simple. The old borders had to return. The empire had to rise again. The turning point, clock ticking. It was the early 2000s. Ukraine was torn between two worlds, one facing west toward Europe and one facing east toward Moscow. In 2004, the Orange Revolution changed everything. Millions of Ukrainians flooded the streets, waving orange flags, demanding fair elections, rejecting corruption. Their message was clear. We choose Europe, not dictatorship. For Russia, it was a warning. Because if Ukraine could turn west, then others might follow, and the dream of a new Russian empire would die before it began. Soft rain sounds. But Putin waited. He watched. He played the long game. The fire ignites. In 2013, Ukraine's president, Viktor Yanukovych, faced a decision that would alter history. He had promised to sign a deal with the European Union, a step that would pull Ukraine firmly into the Western world. But at the last moment, he backed out. Behind the scenes, pressure from Moscow mounted, threats, money, promises. And then on a cold November night, Kyiv erupted. Chanting crowds, distant sirens, hundreds of thousands of people filled Independence Square, the Maidan. Flags waved, fires burned, and voices cried out for dignity, for future, for freedom. It wasn't just a protest, it was a revolution. The government cracked down, snipers on rooftops, dozens killed, hundreds wounded. But the people didn't leave. They stood their ground, for days, for weeks, for months, until the regime collapsed. Yanukovych fled to Russia. Ukraine celebrated, but in Moscow, fury was boiling. The Crimea moment. Footsteps on snow, February 2014. Russian troops, without flags, without insignia, silently appeared across the Crimean peninsula. Airports seized, parliament surrounded, and in a matter of days, Crimea was gone. Russia called it reunification. The world called it annexation. But for millions, it was something deeper. The moment when the post-Cold War peace shattered forever. The West imposed sanctions. NATO raised alarms. But for Putin, it was a victory, bloodless, swift, and wildly popular at home. He had taken back what he believed was rightfully Russia's. And he believed no one would dare stop him. A new frontier of conflict, gunfire in distance. Soon after Crimea, armed conflict erupted in eastern Ukraine, in the Donbas region. Pro-Russian separatists declared breakaway republics. Moscow denied involvement, but the weapons, money, and men told another story. For the next 8 years, eastern Ukraine burned slowly, villages destroyed, families torn apart, thousands killed. The world moved on. But the war never ended. And in that silence, a greater storm was gathering. The world looks away by 2020. As the world battled a pandemic, Russia was preparing for something much larger. Troops massed near the Ukrainian border, first 10,000, then 50,000. Low ambient hum, distant rain. The night of February 24, 2022, a night that was supposed to be impossible. In cities across the world, television screens flickered with disbelief. A superpower had just launched a full-scale invasion in Europe, something the world thought it would never see again. But in the Kremlin, the decision had already been made. For Vladimir Putin, it was not an act of aggression. It was an act of restoration. He believed he was reclaiming history itself. The return of the empire, soft ticking of a clock. In Putin's mind, the Soviet collapse was not an event. It was a wound. For over 20 years, he had watched the West expand its influence, watched NATO grow, and watched Russia's allies disappear one by one. To him, Ukraine was the final frontier, the red line. He looked at Ukraine's growing ties with the European Union, its new weapons, its Western training, and he saw not independence, but encirclement. Every year, more NATO troops appeared closer to Russian borders. Every year, more joint exercises, more promises, more military aid. And in Putin's eyes, Ukraine was becoming the West's sword aimed straight at Moscow. So he chose war, not out of sudden rage, but out of long, deliberate conviction. He wanted to redraw the map of Europe. He wanted the world to remember that Russia was still an empire. The failure of peace. Before the war began, world leaders scrambled to prevent it. French President Emmanuel Macron flew to Moscow, pleading for peace. German and American diplomats warned of sanctions. But behind Putin's icy stare, the decision was already sealed. Room ambience, muffled voices in Russian. During one tense meeting with his Security Council, he asked each member whether Russia should recognize the separatist regions in eastern Ukraine as independent states. They all agreed, though some hesitated, their eyes betraying fear. Putin's voice cut through the silence. We have no choice. It was not democracy. It was theater. The stage was set for war. Inside the invasion plan, metal doors closing, military radio static. For months, Russian troops had been building up along Ukraine's borders. Satellite images showed it all. Armored convoys, missile systems, field hospitals. Signs not of drills, but preparation. U.S. intelligence warned of an imminent invasion. Many in Europe doubted it. They believed Putin was bluffing, using pressure to gain leverage in negotiations. But inside Russia's command centers, battle maps were already being drawn. The goal was simple and devastating. Cripple Ukraine's defenses within days, decapitate its leadership, and install a new pro-Russian government in Kyiv. Russian generals predicted they would take Kyiv in less than a week. They believed Ukrainians would surrender or even welcome them. But they had miscalculated. Catastrophically. The day Kyiv stood still, sirens, explosions in distance. As Russian missiles struck Ukrainian cities, millions tried to flee. Highways out of Kyiv were jammed, mothers clutching children, fathers waving goodbye, soldiers rushing to the front. But amidst the chaos, something remarkable happened. Ukraine did not collapse. President Zelensky refused to run. He recorded videos from the streets saying, "We are here." Those 3 words became a rallying cry. Ukrainians fought back, not as soldiers, but as people defending their homes. Ordinary citizens made Molotov cocktails, built barricades, and blocked tanks with their bodies. The world watched in awe, whispering wind. What was supposed to be a 3-day operation had turned into a grinding war of resistance. The West responds. Within days, the global order shifted. Sanctions like never before, banks cut off, assets frozen, oligarchs stranded. Russia's economy shook, but in Moscow the propaganda machine roared to life. On Russian TV, the invasion was called a special operation, a mission to denazify Ukraine, a twisted narrative, painting Ukraine's government as dangerous nationalists and Putin as a liberator. Inside Russia, independent media vanished overnight, journalists arrested, websites blocked, truth silenced. Meanwhile, in the West, solidarity surged, Europe united in ways unseen for decades. NATO, once divided, suddenly found purpose. Countries like Finland and Sweden, long neutral, now saw the truth. Neutrality was no longer safe. The battle for information, news chatter, overlapping voices. This war was not just fought with bombs and bullets. It was fought with words, images, and lies. Russian state media flooded screens with distorted history. They claimed Ukraine was run by fascists, that NATO had forced Russia's hand, that civilians were being liberated. But on social media, a different story emerged. Videos of bombed hospitals, cries from underground shelters. The faces of war went viral, and the world could no longer look away. For the first time, a war unfolded in real time before millions of smartphones. And in that digital battlefield, Ukraine's voice grew stronger than Russia's propaganda. Zelensky, once a comedian and actor, became a wartime symbol, broadcasting daily from Kyiv, rallying the world through a cracked phone screen. It wasn't strategy, it was survival, and it worked. The cost of ambition. But ambition comes with a price, for both sides. Russia's early offensives failed. Convoys stalled. Troops ran out of fuel and food. Logistics collapsed. Entire columns were ambushed by Ukrainian forces using Western-supplied weapons. The image of Russian military might began to crumble. Bodies lay frozen in the snow. Burned-out tanks lined the roadsides. The lightning operation had turned into a nightmare. Inside Russia, whispers began. Mothers searched for their sons. Coffins returned home, unacknowledged, unspoken. State TV said nothing, but the truth seeped through like blood through cloth. Slow piano melody. And for Ukraine, the cost was unbearable. Cities reduced to ashes, families separated. Millions fled westward, the largest refugee crisis in Europe since World War II. The war that began in Putin's mind as an act of power had become a tragedy for both nations. The world divides. As the war dragged on, a new world order began to take shape. The West rallied behind Ukraine, with billions in weapons and aid. But not everyone joined the chorus. China stayed silent, watching, calculating. India walked a careful line, trading with both sides. Countries in Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America began questioning Western narratives. They saw hypocrisy, wars forgotten in their lands, now remembered in Europe. The world was splitting, not just over Ukraine, but over truth itself. A war of futures. Low rumble of thunder. By late 2022, the battlefield stretched for thousands of kilometers. Every village, every field, every river, fought over, lost, and retaken. Ukraine's forces, armed with Western missiles and drones, pushed back. They reclaimed towns that had been under Russian occupation for months. But the scars were deep. Mass graves. broken homes, lost generations. Each victory carried the weight of grief. And in the Kremlin, Putin's vision of swift conquest dissolved into paranoia. He purged generals, silenced critics, and clung to one belief, that he was fighting not Ukraine but the entire West. The illusion of power, now cracking. The cost of ambition, now visible. And still, the guns did not stop. The cliffhanger, drone hum growing louder. By winter, a new phase had begun. Iranian drones filled the skies, striking power grids and plunging cities into darkness. Russia had turned to new allies desperate to sustain the war. Ukraine's winter became a test of endurance, heatless, powerless, sleepless. Yet the people endured, lighting candles, singing in shelters, refusing to break. The war had evolved, no longer about land, but about survival. And as the snow fell once again on the ruins of Mariupol and Kherson, one truth became painfully clear. This was not just a battle for territory, it was a battle for identity, for the very idea of what it means to be free, soft silence. But what happens when a war built on lies meets the limits of reality? What happens when the empire begins to bleed from within? The answer lies ahead. Fade to black. Low heartbeat sound winter. A bitter wind crawls across the empty streets of Bakhmut, a city that once echoed with laughter, now reduced to rubble. Shells fall in the distance. A dog howls in the ruins. Under a shattered bridge, a Ukrainian soldier warms his hands over a fading fire. He stares at the horizon, at nothing, and whispers, "How long will this last?" The war, once expected to end in days, has now stretched into years, and beneath the smoke and fire, both nations are beginning to fracture from within. The frozen front lines, wind-blowing, muffled artillery. By early 2023, the front lines barely moved. Russia controlled the east and south, a vast scar across Ukraine, but for every village taken, 100 soldiers were lost. Trenches, mud, and blood, reminiscent of World War I. The initial blitz had failed. Now, the war had turned into a slow, grinding test of endurance. Russia poured in conscripts, young men poorly trained, poorly equipped, yet sent forward to die. Ukraine, meanwhile, clung to Western lifelines, missiles, tanks, ammunition, each shipment keeping the fight alive. The battlefield was no longer about land. It was about time. Who could last longer? The cracks in the empire, echo of footsteps in marble hallways. In Moscow, behind gilded doors and heavy curtains, the illusion of control was beginning to falter. Sanctions had bitten deep. Banks frozen, technology blocked, exports strangled. Factories slowed and the economy began to quietly decay. But state television told a different story, a tale of triumph, defiance, destiny. In public squares, giant screens displayed victories that never happened. To question the narrative was to invite ruin. Those who spoke out disappeared. Journalists, generals, even loyal allies. Among the elite, fear replaced faith. Oligarchs who once toasted in luxury yachts now found themselves isolated, sanctioned, hunted by their own wealth. One by one, they began to fall from windows. Mysterious accidents that became a pattern too obvious to ignore. Inside the Kremlin, Putin's circle tightened. Suspicion ruled. And with each passing day, power became lonelier, colder. The silent Russia, soft wind through birch trees. In towns across Russia, mothers waited for sons who would never return. They received no official word, only silence and a small sum of money. Funerals held in secret, graves unmarked. Still, protests flickered, small, brave, doomed. Women holding blank signs in the snow, students chanting in whispers, but police vans swallowed them whole, and the streets went quiet again. Putin's approval ratings remained high, not because of love, but because of fear. The propaganda had turned citizens into spectators, and the empire was rotting in silence. Ukraine under fire, air raid sirens, rumble of distant missiles. In Ukraine, victory carried its own weight. Cities stood but broken. Infrastructure lay in ruins. Bridges collapsed, hospitals bombed, schools turned to ash. Millions remained abroad, refugees rebuilding lives in Poland, Germany, and beyond. Families separated, homes gone, but spirits unbroken. Zelensky, now the face of defiance, moved from one bomb shelter to another. Exhaustion lined his face. The world saw a hero, but behind the camera, he was just a man trapped in an endless nightmare. Ukraine's army had grown stronger, yes, trained by NATO, armed with modern weapons. But every counteroffensive came with a price measured in lives. For every city reclaimed, a generation was lost. Soft piano. The world's sympathy was deep, but not infinite. Slowly, fatigue crept in. As months turned into years, headlines shifted, attention faded, and Ukraine began to fear the most dangerous weapon of all, forgetting. The global ripple. Broadcast static fades in. The war reshaped the planet in quiet, invisible ways. Energy markets collapsed, then rebounded. Europe faced a winter without Russian gas. Factories closed, prices soared. Nations scrambled for new suppliers, from Qatar to Norway. The very lifeblood of modern civilization, oil and gas, had become a weapon again. In Africa and Asia, food prices skyrocketed. Ukraine's wheat, once feeding millions, was trapped in blockaded ports. Hunger spread like smoke, unseen but deadly. And yet geopolitics marched on. China and Russia grew closer, both bound by resentment toward the West. India balanced on the edge, trading with Moscow while maintaining peace with Washington. The old world order was breaking and something uncertain was taking its place. The war of technology, drone buzzing. This was not a war of trenches alone. It was a war of drones, satellites, and cyber strikes. High above the earth, Western satellites guided Ukrainian missiles. Below, hackers from both sides launched digital assaults, crippling networks, exposing secrets. Even the internet became a battlefield. Drones turned ordinary skies into nightmares. Cheap, precise, relentless. They hunted soldiers, convoys, even civilians. The face of modern war had changed forever. No longer fought by men alone, but by machines, code, and silence. And as both sides adapted, one thing became clear. The future of warfare had arrived, and it was terrifyingly efficient. The fog of truth, news montage sounds, voices overlapping in multiple languages. As the front lines stagnated, truth became the first casualty. Both sides fought to control the narrative. Ukraine released heroic footage. Russia released denials and edited victories. Somewhere between the headlines and the hashtags, the real story, human suffering, was lost. Global audiences consumed the war like a series, each explosion a new episode. Attention spiked, faded, moved on. But for those living in it, there was no pause, no skip, no end. The inner war in Russia, isolation bred delusion. In Ukraine, trauma bred resolve. Both nations were transforming, not just politically, but spiritually. In Russian schools, textbooks rewrote history. Children were taught that Ukraine had never been real, that it was always Russia's. A generation was being shaped by lies, designed to outlast the truth. Meanwhile, in Ukraine, patriotism became identity. Language, culture, flag, once shared with Russia, now stood as shields against it. Ukraine's pain had forged a new nation, one that would never go back. Soft wind blowing through ruins. The cost of leadership. Leadership is not power. It is loneliness disguised as duty. In Moscow, Putin retreated deeper into his fortress, isolated, surrounded by fear. He trusted no one. Every decision came slower, colder, harsher. The longer the war lasted, the fewer choices he had left. In Kyiv, Zelensky faced his own solitude. Every visit from Western allies brought applause and promises, but not peace. Behind his speeches, he carried a silent truth. No one could truly understand what it meant to lead a country in ruins. Two men, opposite in every way, yet bound by the same weight, the unbearable cost of ambition. The world without winners. Soft strings fading in. By mid-2023, analysts began to admit what few wanted to say. There would be no easy victory, for anyone. Russia couldn't advance, Ukraine couldn't reclaim it all, and the world couldn't end it. Diplomacy flickered, peace talks, mediators, proposal, all drowned by gunfire. Each side believed time would favor them. But time, like history, favors no one. The illusion of control, that any leader, any nation could truly manage war, was breaking apart. The cliffhanger wind howls, faint church bells. In the ruins of Soledar, amidst frozen silence, a single bell still rings. Its sound travels across no man's land, over trenches, over corpses, over ghosts. And in that lonely echo lies a question the world still cannot answer. When both sides believe they are right, who dares to say who is wrong? Fade to silence. But history is not done. Because as the guns keep firing, another battle is brewing, not on the front lines, but inside the minds of those still fighting. The next phase will not be about conquest or defense. It will be about survival, of truth, of nations, of humanity itself. Heartbeat fades, low ambient wind, distant thunder. A single light flickers in the basement of a collapsed building in Kherson. A mother cradles her child, whispering a lullaby drowned by the hum of drones overhead. Above her, the night burns, flashes of orange and red tearing through the sky. This is not just war. It's exhaustion turned into survival. By the fourth year of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the world had changed, quietly, profoundly, and perhaps forever. Borders were redrawn not just on maps, but in hearts. And what began as a war of invasion had become a war of endurance, for nations, leaders, and truth itself. The war drags on, metallic hum of machinery, drone buzzing. The front lines stretched endlessly, trenches, ruins, and bodies frozen in the snow. Russia continued its relentless bombardment. Ukraine countered with precision strikes, reclaiming one shattered village at a time. Neither side could win outright. Neither side could afford to lose. Behind every explosion, the calculus of politics continued, measured not in lives but leverage. And both Moscow and Kyiv knew that perception was now as powerful as the battlefield. The world had grown used to the daily rhythm of death. Another missile, another speech, another promise of aid. But behind closed doors, the cracks in global unity were beginning to show. The fatigue of allies. Soft chatter fades in, voices of diplomats arguing. At first, the West stood united. Sanctions, weapons, aid, resolve. But unity, like endurance, fades over time. European economies strained under energy shortages. Inflation rose, public anger simmered. In cafes and parliaments, whispers began. How long will we keep paying for this war? In the U.S., political divisions deepened. Support for Ukraine became a partisan debate. Some called it defending democracy, others called it wasting billions. For the first time, Ukraine began to sense the cold edge of uncertainty. Would the world still stand by them when the cameras turned away? Zelensky pleaded, traveled, begged for unity, in Brussels, Washington, London. Each handshake came with applause. But behind those smiles, fatigue was spreading like rust. Moscow under pressure, clock ticking in Kremlin halls. Inside Russia, pressure took a darker shape. The economy, though resilient, was bleeding slowly. Oil exports found new buyers, yes, but at a price. Technological isolation crippled industries, from aviation to microchips. And sanctions had turned the nation inward, proud, bitter, defiant. The propaganda machine kept citizens believing in victory. But belief is fragile when coffins return home. Every funeral became a whisper of doubt. Every missing soldier, a secret too heavy to hide. Putin responded with force, mass mobilization, new conscription laws, censorship at every level. He framed it as patriotism. But beneath the surface, fear ruled. Thousands fled Russia, journalists, programmers, students, an exodus of the nation's brightest minds. And the ones who stayed learned the new rule of survival: silence. The shifting world order, news montage, overlapping languages, Beijing, Ankara, Tehran. Far from Europe, new alliances quietly formed. China deepened its trade with Russia, buying oil, selling drones, offering peace plans written in ambiguity. India continued its delicate balancing act, friend to both sides, servant to none. Turkey positioned itself as mediator and opportunist, selling weapons to Ukraine while buying gas from Russia. The war had become more than a regional conflict. It was a mirror, reflecting the world's hidden rivalries: East versus West, democracy versus autocracy, truth versus propaganda. In that mirror, the illusion of global unity shattered. Everyone had chosen a side, even those who pretended not to. The human cost, slow strings, sound of footsteps in snow. Beyond the politics, there was the quiet suffering no headline could capture: cities without power, children without schools. A generation growing up in shelters knowing only the sound of sirens. In both nations, the scars ran deep. Russian soldiers came home broken, haunted by what they'd seen or done. Ukrainian families lived in exile, unable to return to places that no longer existed. And through it all, the question lingered: what was any of this truly for? A land, a border, a man's dream of history reborn. Soft silence, the death of truth. The longer the war lasted, the harder it became to tell what was real. Propaganda became oxygen. Every narrative had a mirror image, every fact a counterfact. In Russia, the war was presented as liberation. In Ukraine, as survival. In the West, as defense of democracy. And somewhere between all these truths was the human one, unspoken, unseen. Information had become a weapon sharper than any missile. A lie repeated long enough could outlive the truth, and both sides learned how to wield it. The silent diplomacy, soft ticking, low murmurs of translators. Behind the scenes, back channels quietly reopened. Turkey, China, the United Nations, all tried to broker some form of peace. Meetings in Geneva, whispers in Ankara, calls between Washington and Moscow. But peace in times of pride is a word no one dares to speak first. Putin demanded recognition of annexed territories. Ukraine demanded full withdrawal and justice for war crimes. The positions were irreconcilable, frozen as the front lines themselves. Each failed negotiation left another layer of bitterness. Each delay, another 1,000 lives. And the world, watching from afar, began to realize there are wars that can be won, and wars that can only be endured. The shadow war, low drone hum, distant explosion. By mid-2024, the conflict had evolved into something darker, a shadow war. Sabotage inside Russia, explosions at fuel depots, air bases, even deep in Moscow's heart. Cyber attacks cut power, jammed systems, and leaked state secrets. The front lines no longer defined the war. The entire continent did. Every strike carried the risk of escalation. Every misfire could ignite a global crisis. It was a chessboard where every move brought the world closer to the edge, and no one wanted to be the one to push it over. The crisis of faith, soft church bells, echoes of prayer. Inside both countries, faith was tested. For Russians, the idea of victory became abstract, no longer glory but necessity. For Ukrainians, survival had turned into endurance beyond human limits. Zelensky's nightly addresses grew heavier, his tone quieter. He no longer promised victory soon, only that Ukraine would never surrender. It wasn't politics anymore. It was faith. And yet, even faith can falter when the world grows tired of watching. The breaking point. Slow build-up, thunder approaching. By late 2024, whispers of negotiations returned, unofficial, fragile, desperate. Both sides, bled dry, began to realize what victory meant. Nothing. Because even if one side won, what would remain? A land of ashes, a generation lost, a future mortgaged to vengeance. The war had reached its breaking point, not on the battlefield, but in the human spirit. In Moscow, Putin faced his own reflection, aging, isolated, haunted by ghosts of past rulers. He had wanted to be Peter the Great. Now he risked becoming Nicholas II. In Kyiv, Zelensky faced his exhausted, resolute, alone. He had wanted to rebuild Ukraine. Now he was fighting to ensure it still existed. Two men, both trapped in the momentum of history, neither able to stop what they had started. Soft piano fades. The cliffhanger, distant rumble of thunder. As winter returned, snow began to fall again on the same cities that had burned 2 years before. Nothing had changed, yet everything had. Children played among ruins, soldiers wrote letters they might never send, and the world watched, weary, divided, afraid. Because somewhere deep inside the chaos, a dangerous thought was taking root, that maybe peace was no longer possible. Thunder cracks fade to black. But history is never finished. And what comes next will decide not only the fate of Ukraine or Russia, but the fate of the world that allowed it all to happen. Soft wind, distant church bells. Snow falls gently on a land that no longer remembers peace. The sound of sirens has faded into the rhythm of everyday life. And where once there were cities of light, now stand shadows, filled with ghosts and memory. Ukraine, Russia, two nations bound by history, divided by blood and forever changed by the decisions of a few. But as the smoke settles, the world begins to ask the hardest question of all. What was it all for? The war after the war, slow ticking of a clock. Wars don't end when the guns fall silent. They end when hearts stop fighting. By the end of 2024, ceasefire lines had frozen across the map. Not peace, just pause. Both armies dug in behind ruins that once were homes. No one claimed victory. No one could. Ukraine, battered yet unbroken, turned to rebuild. Its people, scattered across Europe, began to return, some to homes, others to ashes. Every street was a memory, every memory a scar. In Russia, victory was declared. Parades, speeches, medals. But behind the red flags and orchestrated applause, silence grew. A silence filled with the unspoken, the lost sons, the broken mothers, the truth buried beneath pride. Because the deeper truth was this: Russia had not won. Ukraine had not lost. The world had simply changed its shape. The cost of ambition, low rumble of thunder fading into silence. History is full of men who tried to reshape it. Putin was one of them. He believed that strength could rewrite borders, that power could restore an empire, that fear could replace respect. And for a time it worked. The world trembled. Sanctions fell. The old Cold War ghosts rose again. But ambition is a fire that consumes its own. By the 5th year, the dream of restoring a greater Russia had turned into something hollow, a kingdom of isolation, where truth was outlawed and loyalty enforced. The empire he sought to build became a fortress of paranoia. And every victory on paper came with a cost in human souls. The illusion of control shattered. The illusion of destiny betrayed. History had given him power, but history would also take it back. Ukraine's resilience, distant church choir, faint candle crackling. Meanwhile, Ukraine became more than a country. It became an idea that courage can exist even in ruin, that freedom can survive even under bombardment, that nations are not defined by their borders, but by their refusal to surrender. Cities like Bucha, Mariupol, Kharkiv, names once whispered in horror, became symbols of endurance, etched into global memory. And Zelensky, once an actor playing a president, had become a president carrying a nation's soul. He was not perfect, not unbroken, but human, and that humanity resonated across the world. Because in a time of propaganda and power, humanity itself had become resistance. The world's reflection. News montage fades in, different voices, overlapping languages. The war in Ukraine had become the mirror of our century. It exposed what we believed in and what we had forgotten. It revealed how fragile peace really is, and it reminded us that truth, when ignored, always returns, louder and crueler. For decades, the world had lived in comfort, believing wars like these belonged to the past. But history never dies. It just waits. And in 2022, history came knocking again, not as a lesson, but as a warning. The loneliness of power, deep echo, slow piano. Somewhere in the Kremlin, beneath chandeliers and marble corridors, an old man sits alone at a long table. He has everything: power, fear, control, and yet nothing: trust, peace, legacy. The portraits of past czars hang above him, their painted eyes heavy with judgment. He thought he was one of them, destined to reshape Russia's destiny. But now his empire is shrinking, his allies uncertain, his people divided. In his quest to make Russia great again, he made it smaller, isolated, wounded, mistrusted. And perhaps in his quietest moments, he wonders if history will remember him not as a ruler, but as a warning. The new Iron Curtain, metal gate closing, echoing footsteps. The war built a new kind of wall, invisible, digital, ideological, between East and West, between truth and propaganda, between freedom and fear. It was not made of steel, but of narratives. And once again, the world divided into camps, each convinced of its own righteousness, each blinded by its own truth. The Cold War never ended. It only changed its form. The children of the war, soft wind, sound of distant laughter. In a small Ukrainian village, a boy plants a tree in the ruins of his school. He doesn't remember the day the war began. He was too young. But he remembers the sound of the earth shaking. He remembers his father never coming back. The tree he plants is small, fragile, defiant. It bends under the cold wind, but it doesn't break. That boy will grow up in a world defined by what this war destroyed. And maybe, just maybe, by what it taught. Because history is not written by politicians or soldiers. It's written by the survivors. The haunting lesson. Low strings, solemn tone. The war between Russia and Ukraine was not just about territory. It was about time, the past refusing to let go of the present. It was about memory and the danger of rewriting it. And it was about fear of a future where truth is negotiable. Empires fall not when they are defeated, but when they stop listening to their people. And nations rise not when they win wars, but when they refuse to lose their soul. The greatest illusion of power is that it lasts. It never does. All power, all ambition, all wars end the same way, with silence. The final reflection, soft piano fades in, birds faintly singing. One day, the war will end. The soldiers will return home, some whole, most not. The rubble will be cleared, the cities rebuilt. But the wounds will stay. Children will ask their parents, why did it happen? And their parents will search for words that no longer exist.